Assalamualaikum. Today's topic which I am going to discuss is narrative theory and social work treatment. Coming towards the topic, narrative therapy is a major trend of the 19th. It has never reached the popular press as Newsweek had a feature story on it. It has had prominence in the professional literature also, especially in social work and marriage and family therapy journals. What is narrative therapy? What is its theoretical base? How does it fit into the existing practice theory of social work? How does it fit into the social work value frame? These questions will be addressed in this chapter, and in addition, how narrative therapy connects to the approaches will be assisted. Coming towards the overview of the theory. The narrative approach described and discussed in this chapter will draw mainly on the works of White and Epstein, family therapists from Australia and New Zealand, respectively. They developed this approach in the 1980s, but it became popularized in North America after their book Narrative Means to Therapeutic Ends and published on this continent in 1990. While some elements of their approach were fairly unique at that time, their work emerged and co-developed in relation to a theoretical and practice development work emerged and co-development in relation to a theoretical and practice development occurring in North America and Europe. Their approach falls under the general rubric of constitutive therapy, several models of which emerged at about the same time and which all developed in relationship to the postmodern culture which crossed many academic disciplines. In 1980s, also Ederson and Goldstein in Texas, Boslow and Xinjiang of Milan, Italy, Penn and Hoffman of the United States, who work with the Millen Group, and Tom of Alberta, Canada, who had studied in the Millen Group, all wrote about these newer qualitative approaches. Clearly, something new was brewing in the therapy world, especially in family therapy. Hoffman, a social worker who is a prominent family therapist, has described the earlier swing of family therapists away from emphasis in intraphysic focus to systems view with emphasis on interpersonal process and behavior. As now swinging back to more emphasis on ideas, beliefs, feelings, and myths, while system approaches are based on cybernetic theory, a mechanistic theory of control, which Hoffman declared has lost its usefulness, conservative therapies are based on second-order cybernetics, which renders observation as dependent upon the observer. The system theories like the behavior and cognitive approaches emerging in the same time period were based on the modernist view of objectivity, rationality, and knowing theory observation. The postmodern view, which has been embraced by scholars across many disciplines from art and literature to social scientists, on the other hand, recognizes the many realities and truths that coexist and sees reality as being socially constructed rather than given. Relationship to other theories. Postmodern theory is a form of critique for some, while it is a contemporary experience for others. The narrative approach borrows from the conservatives in the field of literary criticism, where narratives are taken apart and analyzed from meaning, and from the social constructors in the view of social psychology, where reality is viewed as co-constructed in the minds of individual in interaction, while other people and societal beliefs. Nine characteristics conservatism as a meta theory that emphasizes the self-organizing and proactive feature of human knowing, and as a view of humans as meaning-making agents. The roots of conservative therapies can be traced to many sources, especially George Kelly's personal construct theory, first anticipated in the 1950s. Kelly himself cited Mendes' Kurzbuch, which was also known upon by cognitive and system therapist and by Morian, who developed psychodrama. Conservative theory has been compared to cognitive theory and to the system approaches, and its emphasis on meaning connect it to the essential approaches. White and Epstein state that they drew on the works of of French philosopher and historian Michael as well as Jerome Bruner and in the development of the narrative therapy. It is interesting to note that the system thinker also drew heavily on Batson. Narrative therapy, it seems, is a paradigm for viewing change in some perspectives, but in other way it can be seen as evolving out of existing practice theories. The narrative postmodern approach to practice can be useful for social workers who, as noted by Scott, search for the meaning of events and behavior as preconditions for actions. The emphasis on understanding and meaning is useful as we work with the diverse clients for today's practice. The application of postmodernity for social work practice has been discussed by several social work scholars. Coming towards basic assumptions, knowledge is a power, and self-knowledge can empower people. White and Epstein believe that all story our lives to make sense out of them. We cannot remember all of our lived experiences. There is too much material and too many experiences unrelated to each other to retain it all. So our narrative structuring experience is a selective process. We arrange our life into sequence and into dominant storylines to develop a sense of coherence and to ascribe meanings to our life. As we develop our dominant storyline, we remember events that support it and forget other life experiences that do not fit into the dominant story line. Certain events may be imagined or exaggerated to fill in the gaps of a storyline. Certain events may be imagined and exaggerated to fill in the gaps of the story. White and absent concept of subjective knowledge is similar to the psychodynamic concept of unconsciousness, in that both refer to forgotten material. They are different, however, in that subjective knowledge refers to life experiences that are that are not remembered because they do not fit into the dominant story, whereas the psychodynamic idea of unconsciousness refers to memories that are repressed because they are painful. Narrative therapy is similar to postmodern literary criticism, where the same storyline is deconstructed as the plot, characters, and the timeline are reasserted for meaning. Many times presenting problems of clients fall within the dominant storyline, and often clients have author-rated problem stories of their life. This story limits the client views of themselves and others and can immobilize them for action. Their situated story have been co-constructed with others around them. Often family members, employers, social service workers, and other helpers. For example, social service agencies working to help multi-need families can do too much for them, giving the message that they are incompetent, and their dominant narrative becomes that of a multi-problem or dysfunctional family. Similarly, Wine, Sheets, and Sirkin discuss how for chronically ill people, the illness may become the dominant storyline. As the family and professional helpers gradually become more involved with the patient, and the co-constructed reality is that the patient is the illness, as opposed to being afflicted with it. A goal of narrative therapy is to help the client see more realities, which offers more alternatives for them. As Neimer has noted, this therapy is more creative than corrective, and it's more reflective as elaborative than preservative or instructive. Role of social worker or social therapist. As narrative therapy helps clients reorder their lives through seeing other truths and other possible interpretation of events, the role of the therapist is to listen, wonder, and ask reflective questions. Clients are invited to assess other realities, which are not necessarily more true, but are also true. For most narrative therapists, the harsh realities of many clients' lives, such as poverty, racism, or violence, are not denied as just constructs of the mind, but the power given to these adverse events and the control they have over clients' lives are challenged. Questions are introduced which help the client assess other ways to view a situation, analyze for alternative meanings, and find other aspects of their lives, often involving strength and coping, which may find other aspects for their lives, often involving steps which have been lost in the over-focus on problems. In the postmodern view, the therapist is not an outside objective observer, but is part of the change system, and there is reciprocal influence between client and clinician. Thus, the therapist does not just hear the client's story but co creates it with the client, hopefully, with the client creating some new stories. History is not a collection of facts to be remembered, but is created in the telling. The therapist's role is non-hierarchical, especially compared to either psychodynamic or system therapist. The therapist is not the expert on the problem or the client's life. The client is. The therapist takes a not knowing position which invites the client to do more exploring. Cultural sensitivity. Narrative theory is culturally sensitive because it does not presume a way of being, but aims to understand the client's reality. The therapist listens for ways in which gender, culture, and social and economic context may shape their client's worldview. The not knowing position is useful in this respect too, as the therapist learns from the client. Wald, Graves especially has discussed ethnic sensitive conservative therapy, for as noted by Lowe, these therapeutic discourse can encourage discussion of social justice, poverty, gender, and power. All the family centre in New Zealand, Walgrave and colleagues have developed just therapy, where therapists and clients together weave webs of meaning, where political as well as clinical responses are required, and where cross-cultural concerns are used to the therapy teams. View of human nature. The view of humanity underlying this approach is that humans are complex and multifaceted. Underlying pathology is not pursued. Rather than listening for underlying root cause, the social worker listens for underlying strengths which can be mobilized for signs or signals of exceptions to the problem, which have been ignored, or unique outcomes which cannot be explained by the client's story, and for times when things have gone well. Here, similarities to solution-focused therapy of social workers in Schuberg and Steve DeShays can be seen. Borden discusses the importance of helping the client access the past, experience the present, and anticipate the future, as specific life experiences are incorporated into the ongoing life story While attention is paid to the past, the focus is to help the client not to stuck in the past but to develop a progressive forward-looking narrative. Narrative therapists see the clients in context, that is part of a cultural whole where views of self and the world are co-constructed in interaction with culture and societal norms. Clients are invited to access the truths they have assumed and to challenge views which had not been usual. In this way, they may empower themselves to work on their own behalf or for social change. Further, as needs are assessed with client and clinical working together, the client may be made aware of resources available and the clinician may suggest a referral. Making list of referrals to solve problem, however, is not a part of this approach. In sense, then the clients become their own case manager, assessing their own needs and monitoring the services they receive. In this view, biological base of some conditions are not denied, nor is the potential usefulness of psychotropic medications for some people. The diagnosis and treatment of medical conditions are not in the realm for social work treatment. However, and clients are encouraged to discuss such concerns with physicians. Clients on psychotropic medicines are encouraged to develop a partnership reality with the prescribing physician, working together to fight the effects of illness rather than becoming passive recipients of treatment. Social work treatment. The goal of narrative treatment approach in social work practice is for clients first to understand and then to broaden and change the stories around which they have organized their lives. This work may involve helping the clients to challenge the problems, saturated dominant story as the only vote, and to find other aspects for his or her life which may also be true. The discovery of more realities and more truths can free clients to see more alternatives and ways out of an impasse. It can also help clients recognize and mobilize the strengths they already possess and are using, but many have ignored in the focus on problem. Through dialogue between social worker and client, these problem-saturated theories are gradually deconstructed as the worker introduces questions that challenge the client's narrow view of reality or draw out facts of the client's life that have previously been ignored. Some conservatives and conservative approaches other little guidance to the work or client and little structure of the process. The Down Under therapists from New Zealand and Australia offer a bit more structure where they challenges not useful stories more than many of their North American counterparts or stories are not seen as equally useful. The narrative model offered by White and Epstein is useful for teaching and for practice because it names specific practices and outlines stages of the process without being too prescriptive or technique driven. Conservative therapist is a general do not distinguish between the assessment and treatment stages of practice. They view assessment as an ongoing and ever-changing process in the hope that all sessions are therapeutic. All clinicians have now, however, that there are some elements of the helping process which are more appropriate in early stages and something more useful later in the process. For this reason, White and Epstein discussion of the stage of their narrative approach as demonstration and restructuration is useful. Demonstration stage. deconstruction stage. In the deconstruction stage, the client's existing stories are heard and reconstructed. Even here, there are stages. It is important not to deconstruct the client's story too soon. Most people need to have their problem story heard before they can move to other areas. First, the clinician carefully listens to the client's story. What does he or she define as the presenting problem? How does the client experience it? What meaning is ascribed to it, and how it is viewed in light of historical events? This process is similar to the joining or relationship building process of any good therapeutic endeavor. Asking questions to elect the full meaning here is important. Who else is involved in the problem? What even in the past have contributed to its development? How did this problem evolve over time? What has been tried to fight the effects of the problem? How has this problem affected other aspects of the client's life? As in good therapeutic encounter, that the development of an empathic relationship is important. The empathy is important for developing trust, but it is also important in helping the clinician understand the client's reality more fully. While the careful listening and reflecting is similar to most therapeutic approaches, the way the questions are worded is specific to a narrative approach. Externalizing the problem. A key idea is this in this narrative therapy begins in the joining stage and continues throughout the treatment process. The purpose of this externalization is to separate the person from the problem, to view it as not interesting to the person but as something that has interfered with the person's life and needs to be challenged. Thus, at early stages where the client's story is being heard and understood, the nature of the reflective question gradually shifts the view as to where the problem resides. When did you first notice that this depression began to interfere with your work? How did it happen that Andy temper took over as much of its life? Who first noticed it? Who has been affected most by it? It is important to distinguish between taking responsibility and viewing a problem as not interesting to the person. Clients are encouraged to take responsibility to fight the effects of the problem and for their own behavior. Even the effects of physical illness can be externalized through questions about the effects of the illness on the person's life and about the process by which it took on so much power over the person's life and about how it has interfered with other aspects of the person's life, including relationships. As the client is able to separate from the problem, it becomes more manageable and the problem, not the person, becomes the target for change. The client and therapist join together to fight the effects of the problem at this early stage, even before deconstruction. The clinician listens carefully to the client's definition of the problem and begins to objectify the problem through the use of metaphors, through summary, and through the nature of the reflective questions. The importance of language in shaping meaning has been discussed by many theorists and therapists over the view. The way questions are worded is an important aspect of the work. White has described the way in which he helped a family with a 12-year-old son with behavior problems to escape from trouble. He asked family members to describe the ways in which John's problem has plagued his life and influenced their lives. White also asked the parents how they had coped with John's troubles and how they had become involved with them. Narrative therapists, unlike those from several other schools, do not assume that the clients themselves need the problem or that it symbolizes a deeper problem, as to do some psychodynamic therapists, nor do they believe that it serves a function for the family unit. As believed by some systematic proponents, it assumes that clients that clients want the problem solved or remediated, but they have gotten stuck in finding ways to do so. The words like unmotivated or resistant are not considered useful. This belief in the client as what they say is very respectful and then consistent with social work values. While it is not presumed that a client's need problem is recognized that they and family members and friends may have helped to maintain the problem, possibly through their efforts to solve them. Thus, the influence questions are useful in bringing about discussion on that matter. For example, family members may be asked how they were redirected into and influenced by the client's problem. After the first part of the reconstruction stage, where the client view are heard, understood, and acknowledged, the therapist gradually begins to help the client deconstruct the dominant story through continued summarizing and questions. It is important to note here that a story is not disputed or seen as not true, for that would not be respectful and the client would not feel validated. Instead, the story is fully discussed and analyzed for meaning and other interpretation and other meanings can be assisted, bringing about alternative truths which are also valid. And this point, the relative influence of the problem effects on the individual or family made it across time and across spheres. Excuse me. How has this problem affected the client in the past, present, and anticipated further across intellectual, personal, interpersonal, and social spheres? For example, in the wide case of helping the family escape the trouble mentioned above, it became clear through discussion that John's trouble had interfered with his life at school, academically, and with classmates, and at home in the relationship with his parents. In addition, the problem has crept into his parents' life and affected their relationship with each other as well as their own work productivity. Ways in which the trouble had caused guilt in John and feeling of helplessness in his parents were discussed. Questions were introduced to John regarding what would happen if he were to further succumb to trouble to his parents, about what might be the possible effect of the continued participation in the problem. Should they accept John's invitation to join him in participating in trouble, or should they renounce it and escape from it? This very careful dissection of the effect of the problem across all spheres of life and assessment of what might happen in the future if it is allowed to dominate challenge the family to find new ways to handle the problem. The clients can now work with the clinician to explore ways to defend themselves against the effects of the problem and to fight it when Alhamdulillah. When necessary. Since the problem is externalized, the client does not need to defend himself or him or herself to the clinician, but can join with the clinician to find ways to defend against the problem, which is interfering with his or her life. As the problem stories are gradually deconstructed through a dialogue between client and the clinician obtains a full history of the problem. The client discusses events that they believe led up to the problem formation, not only the events but the thoughts, belief, and social interaction around the event are assessed for influence in the past, present, and problem and possible future. Client might be asked to ponder how the same events may have been viewed by others or even how they might view it themselves if they were not involved. For example, a victim of childhood abuse may have blamed herself or himself, but may now begin to see that being a child and in a helpless position may have had some bearing on the situation. Alternative futures are also discussed. How would it be if things were different and who would do that? Who would first notice the difference? What would a better future look like? Here again, similarities to de-shared solution-focused therapy may be noticed. The visioning of a desired future also help clients begin to think about ways in which they might get there. Reconstruction stage. In the second stage, the reconstruction stage, other truths are found which are also true but may have been subjected because they do not fit into a dominant theme. It is a knowledge expanding more than knowledge changing experiences. The subjective knowledge is brought out through careful listening for unique outcomes. As clients tell their stories, these are events or outcomes that cannot be explained by the dominant story. For example, a man has described his problem as being a bully, stating that he has also been mean and has had a temper problem most of his life. How it has interferes with his relationship with his children are discussed. How it has also hurt himself, causing a feeling of guilt and lowered self-esteem is also examined. Looking to the future, he sees a lovely existence in the problem continues to dominate his life. It is important to obtain his view and the situation, not to assume that this is a bad behavior, even if it is, which he wants to stop. The purpose of helping him to separate from the problem is not to alienate him from responsibility for his action, but to help him assess its effects on self and others, make a decision as to what he wants to do about it, and then develop ways to manage and control it. In fact, responsibility was implied here, as the client was asked about how the temper had taken over his life and how he had let this happen. Here, the unique outcomes were not easy to find at first, but careful listening helped to uncover some. If he is such a tough guy, where did he find the gentleness to visit his grandmother in a nursing home? How he had, how was he able to master enough collection force therapy can be seen. But instead of asking for exception which the client may not see, the therapist carefully sorts through the conversation in a detective-like manner to find the evidence, just as the dominant story has been deconstructed to find who was involved in the construction of the tough guy identity. Now, the client is asked to think about who may have helped him develop his gentler side. Gradually, a discussion of a relationship with a caring grandfather is brought out, and the gentle but mainly teacher is also remembered. In addition, the cultural message in the media of needing to be tough to be a man is also compared to the conflicting social message about the honorable gentleman treating women and children well. Knowing there is another side of him helps the client find ways to fight the effects of the tough side, which allows him to keep aspect of that side while exploring and developing other aspects of himself, such as the gentle idea. In other situations, a family that was viewed by others in the community as well as themselves as being a poor and out of control family with violent adolescent boys was challenged in this narrow definition of itself. They began to see they are also a resourceful family that has coped with poverty and has found a way for mother to be home with the young children by day and earn some money holding an evening job by having the adolescent boy babysit after school. The discussion also challenged the violent boys' ideas, although the fact that they have acted Violently in school sometime was not ignored. Seeing other aspects of themselves did help them to see that they had an alternative as to which side of themselves they wanted to develop and in which situation. Here the social workers do not tell the boys what they must do, but help them see the options. Both the family and the school reported a marked decrease in violent behavior over the school year. In another example, a social worker in a coping skill group of chronic pain patients helped the patient find ways in which they were already coping with the illness and see that there were times when they could fight with the effects of the illness and when the pain was not as bad. At first, most of the patients believed that the pain was always there and there was nothing they could ever do. Through careful listening, by the worker and each other, they found that there were times when things were better and they all found ways in which they were already coping. The illness was externalized by the social worker asking them if the illness were a member of the family, how would you treat it? The group members began to discuss this question with great interest. Some found ways they could fight the illness and reject it, while others said that since it was there to stay, they would look for ways to accommodate it and to live with it. The social worker do not teach them how to cope, but instead, through careful listening, times when the patients were already coping with identified, challenging the view that they were totally helpless. At this reconstructive stage, then, the clients are helped to reconstruct their views of reality by making it broader, not different. A depressed woman a depressed woman who remembers her childhood as one deprived of maternal touching because her mother was critically ill when she was a child and died when the client was 11. She was asked if she remembered any time that her mother had the time and energy to touch her. The client remembered her mother coping with her hair every day and how good it felt. The tragedy of her mother being so sick that she only did tasks required to the minimum. Good mother was never minimized, but the client was also helped to remember mom good to remember but other aspects of her childhood. She reports that she finds it comforting when depressed now to think how good it felt when her mother combed her hair. Dolan, in her work with sexual abuse survivor has noted that having these clients tell their stories over and over can re-victimize them if corrective experiences are not infused in the process. Helping clients broaden their life stories rather than polishing their problem-situated stories is a corrective experience. Length of the treatment. Because of the philosophical nature of constructivist approach to treatment, it is often assumed that the process is a long-term one, and questions have been raised about how much a long process can be applicable in today's social work practice arena. An interesting aspect of the narrative approach of White and Epstein is that they use relatively few sessions, often as few as 6 or 7, although there is not set idea as to number. Clients are usually asked to the end of each session if they would like to return and if so, how soon. Unlike some constructive therapists, narrative therapists may ask the clients to do some activities between sessions, for example, in helping the boy and the family escape from trouble already discussed. White encourage the family to plan escape meeting where all the family members review the progress of their fight from escape. The meeting were formal in construction and even had minutes taken. While the number of sessions are usually few, they are usually spread out over a longer time period than every week to give the family time to think about and try new things. With families, especially, playful ideas and metaphors are used in asking them to try new things. In addition to asking members to try something different uh, between sessions, White uses for many forms of writing to expand the impact of each session. He often uses therapeutic letters to clients from the therapist between sessions, which summarize his notes as to how he heard the client describe the problem and also record any solution knowledge obtained in the session. The therapist re-question client correction, deletions, and addition to make the statement more accurate. Client report that every letter is worth about 4 sessions. While some might question the time involved in the process, these letters can also be used as case notes. White also find taking notes in session helping, um, not distracting, and he uses these notes to read statements back to clients to check for accuracy. Other forms of writing may also add to the value of session 2, such as clients writing to self or therapist art or poetry or charts and checklists. White and Epstein use certificates and documents such as escape from guilt certificate or a diploma of social knowledge, which are especially useful with children. White also reports other strategies he used to reduce the number of sessions but expands their power. In addition to letters and documents, he may have ceremonies of redefinition where the victory over the problem is celebrated, or he may encourage the family to use consultants who are people in the client's life whom they can talk or to for whom they can talk to for enlightenment about a problem or solution. He also reports that this use of reflecting teams discussed in the training section of this chapter expand the impact of each other. Principal application in social work practice. As can be seen from the above discussion, a primary application of narrative work has been in family therapy and social work with families. As with the system approaches the focus on interaction between people makes narrative approach especially useful with couples and families. However, it is also beneficial in work with individuals, and its usefulness in group work has been explored. While rarely addressed in the literature, the use of narrative approach in community work seems plausible. In fact, at the Family Therapy Centre in Auckland, New Zealand, community work and social action go hand in hand with the family therapy in Wildegraver's Just Therapy. Wildegrave is not a social worker, but his emphasis on social justice is very much in the tradition of social work. Potential problem and counterindications. While there is a wide range of application and narrative type approach in social work, sorry, some questions have been raised regarding their use with specific populations. Some might fear that the sorry that the de-emphasis on reality and the focus away from the problem from the problem story together could minimize the client problem, especially in case of sexual abuse or family violence. There is a real problem if the social worker deconstructs the story too quickly or denies the client's reality, but should not be problematic if the client is carefully listened to and attended. In a related concern, some might see this approach as superficial because it does not get at roots causes for underlying pathology or in deeply destructive individual. Since these ideas do not fall within the constructs of postmodern theory, narrative therapists would not see such concern as relevant. Some social workers might fear that the process of externalization would reduce a perpetrator's responsibility for violence or other crimes. White and Epstein speak directly to this matter and note that helping people separate from the problem and assessing it objectively can help them assume more responsibility for it. Social workers and other professional experts the idea that talking is not that talking is not enough for some clients. The consult service and possibly even medication may be required for the for the amelioration of some problem facing clients. Native therapists agree and believe that their approach can facilitate complementary services. Finally, there is a practical concern that without the use of label, cross-disciplinary discussion may be impeded and that the reimbursement of for services may be denied. These are concerns to ponder and are not completely solvable. It should also be noted that labels may not have to be discarded in some situations, but the power given the labels can be challenged. Because the native approach are relatively new and there is so little research, it is difficult to say at this time which population may or may not be well served by this approach. While native therapists report case studies with successful outcomes with a range of clients, further work needs to be aimed at isolating those clients but served by such approaches. The question raised about their usefulness with some perpetrators of violence with substance abusers need to be more fully addressed. In addition, care needs to be taken in externalizing problems with persons experiencing serious emotional problems who may already have been differentiating between themselves and outside forces, administrative and training factors. Native therapy is used mainly by clinical social workers, family therapists, and psychologists, all of whom have graduate degrees. It involves more than storytelling, it involves story changing through intense listening and question in a specific manner, which is usually learned in special post degree training. The conscious use of self and transference counter interference issues discussed by psychodynamic social workers is also considered important by native social workers. Although they may not use those terms, native social workers need to be very clear about their own issues, views, and experiences to separate them from those of the clients. Since the client's history and the reality are co-constructed through dialogue, the social worker cannot be an outside observer but is a part of the change system through, through reciprocity. Great care must be taken to hear and understand the client's reality and to individualize each client. Thus, there is no set of techniques or prescription. Each client is viewed differently, and treatment involves whatever fits his or her particular situation. A great deal of self awareness and willingness to set aside one's own worldview is required to work in such a manner. Alternative approaches are beginning to be infused to the academic social work curriculum. Most training has been conducted at family therapy training centers or select social service agencies. Training and supervision in these approaches are usually carried out through the use of reflecting terms, which are also part of the therapeutic process for a client. The reflecting term idea has first developed by Anderson in Norway and involves team members behind a one-way mirror trading places with the family at some points in the interview and reflecting back their ideas through discussion about what they thought they had the family say. The reflection by outside person encourages deeper discussion by the family members. Through serving on the reflecting teams, trainers learn to focus their listening and they learn to discover unique outcomes. If the trainers do not hear the clients accurately, it is the clients themselves who point that out of them. After the family listens to the reflecting team's discussion, they trade places again and discuss their ideas as to what they heard the team members say. Trainers can learn by being on either side of the mirror, and the teacher can teach from either side. And through subsequent discussion after the session, White report that most of its clients say that these teams also reduce the number of sessions needed by increasing the impact of each session. The family member must, of course, give permission for the team to observe them, and they may request to meet them first. Even through these team, even through these teams reduce the number of sessions needed by the client, the number of therapists required usually mean this can only be practiced where there are trainers to serve his function. Thus, the case vignette that follows is written by team members of a family therapy training until therapy unit in a community mental health care where reflecting teams are used. The author own cases are noted throughout this chapter, but the following case example is used to demonstrate the reflecting team as an integral part of treatment and training. Case vignette: the Smith family. Mrs. Smith called the community mental health care wanting help to reunify her family. She had two daughters, Rachel, 12 years of age, and Betty, 10 years of age. Rachel was currently in foster care. Mrs. Smith, who is divorced from the girl's abusive father, reported that Rachel had been removed from the home due to the violent outbursts against Betty and Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith stated that both she and Betty are afraid of Rachel, who has a long history of therapy and 7 out of home placements to treat her symptom of aggression and depression. The initial goal of therapy, therefore, was to learn more about what was keeping this family in an uproar and to discern what closest ties do exist. The family was offered the opportunity to work with the center family therapy team. The process of working with a team of therapists using a one-way mirror and the idea of reflecting teams are explained. The family accepted the offer to work in this manner, and the intake appointment, the family was introduced to the team and had an opportunity to inspect the observation room. The team consisted of 5 therapists, two primary therapists working with the family, and 3 trainers who were members of the reflecting team. Behind the mirror, the family talked about their concerns. For 40 to 50 minutes before taking a break to listen to the reflection. At this point, the reflecting team came into the room and discussed the situation with each other while the family and primary therapist sat in the room and listened. Thus, then the team went behind the mirror again while the family and therapist discussed the reflections for another 15 minutes. The first 2 sessions with the family consisted of referring intense, aggressive, physical and verbal arguments between the siblings and their mother, containing the 2 girls' aggressive behavior become prominent. Stories of abuse and violence began to emerge, including domestic violence, verbal abuse, physical fights between siblings, out of control children, an overwhelmed mother who had recently begun to reclaim her life after divorcing her abusive husband. Other themes that began to develop were ideas about good and bad children, comparing Rachel to the abusive father, and Rachel in turn defending her father. The primary therapist working with the family began asking questions to understand how the family experienced these problems and what meaning they understand how the family experience these problems and what meaning they understand to them. They also work questions to reveal and clarify the many realities constructed by the family. The dominant story included fear, violence, abuse, lack of respect, criticism, hopelessness, and resignation to out of control lives. Questions were also asked to determine who was involved in the construction of the story. Example, how did that fit into all of this? Who would agree or disagree? Who else need to be included when we talk about your family? What events contributed to this development? Example, Martha, Mrs. Smith, how did your divorce affect the story of your family? How did the story develop over time? Example, what was it like before? How there always been fighting in your family? What wasn't there fight when wasn't there fighting? What was occurred in your family since you made the appointment? What had been tried to counter the effect of the story on themselves and the family? Example, how would you stood up to violence in your family? How would you have been able uh, to resist violence invitation to hurt one another? These questions were asked to explore alternative meaning and to create space for non-dominant themes and stories to emerge. After a second session, the reflective team made the following comments. Member 1, I am wondering what the girl's behavior means. 2, I was wondering that also I was wondering what they are trying to say. Are they trying to say that they can't be said in this family? I am wondering what can and can't be talked. Third, remember, what could be so hard to express that they could find no words for it? I wonder who might be the first to make some attempts at using some words instead of hurtful behavior. How would it be for this family not to forget and spur? Would it be boring? Is fighting better than not talking? I saw Rachel show lots of different emotion and one of them seemed to be sadness. What would you think that sadness was about? I heard a lot about Rachel's father from Martha and her description sounded pretty brutal. I was wondering how that was for Rachel to hear. I would be interested in hearing other perspective on that and what would need to happen for those alternative descriptions to be heard. Yeah, I was thinking about the comparison that Martha makes about Rachel and Dad. Are there other ways they are similar other than the swearing and fighting? Do you mean did Rachel get some of those good qualities from her dad like loyalty and defending the family against outsiders? Yes, exactly. The post-reflection discussion of the family revealed Rachel's father, also an alcoholic who was abusive to Mrs. Smith, and he was also a good provider to the family and a caring father in some ways. Mrs. Smith was encouraged to pay attention between sessions to positive qualities that Rachel displayed that could be attributed to her father. The family was also encouraged to pay attention to the times when they stood up to abuse and did not let it overpower their interaction. In looking for differences and time when the family was not chaotic, the family reported they were very calmer and were respectful to each other when the maternal and grandfather was present. The mother reported that she felt more confident and competent that her daughters behaved themselves in his presence. The team was intrigued by this difference and wanted to learn more about the grandfather effect on the family. To experience it themselves, they asked the family members if they could be willing to invite him to a next session. They agreed. The following sessions were marked differently when the grandfather accompanied his daughter and granddaughters. Mrs. Smith and her daughter were dressed and groomed better than before. They were less verbal sparing. The conversation was not interrupted by verbal or physical outbursts. During the session, more information was gathered from the non-deceased maternal grandfather and about how Mrs. Smith was raised. The grandfather was given an opportunity to describe the granddaughters and to describe his daughter when she was young. The girls spoke about their memories for their grandmother, and Mrs. Smith remembered her childhood fights with her brother. No effort had to be exerted in controlling Rachel and Betty from destructive behavior. Reflections number 2. I felt I was at a family reunion hearing this family talking about the old days. I heard the grandfather and Martha talk about how she and her brother fought when they were young, and I wondered how those fights were resolved. I wondered how Martha and girls felt today. They interacted differently when the grandfather was present. I wondered if Pat and Stephen, primary therapists, felt the difference. It seemed as though the grandfather was so flexible today. He always had something good to say about someone. What effect do you think this comment had on today's conversation? Everyone seemed to enjoy themselves today as they reminisced about past events. I felt today's meeting was much different from last time. I wonder if it was different for the family. Rachel got so animated talking about her grandmother. Rachel also began to cry when they were talking about grandma. Rachel showed a soft spot when others discussed sad events. Do you think others noticed their softness? What do you think would have helped increase softness in this family? Is it okay to be soft? Post-reflection decision. The family agreed that the session was much calmer and enjoyable. They also were perplexed about what they occurred. A variety of hunches were offered by the family and the therapist. A consensus began to form that it had to do with the respect and validation that was exhibited by the grandmother. Martha and her daughters agreed that they would look for ways to show the same respect to one another at home as they did during the session in the grandfather's presence. Follow up. The family has been seen 5 more times over the next 6 months. While Rachel is still in placement, there is work toward reunification. There is less fighting and more open discussion in this family now. In this discussion, some good traits of the father has been acknowledged, but the reason why the mother could not stay in this relationship have always been discussed more fully. Empirical base. Where written empirical research had been conducted testing narrative approaches, postmodernism by definition denies the possibility of objectivity, which is at the core of empiricism. For this reason, postmodern approaches have been criticized for keeping social work out of the scientific field where it should be placed. While constructivists are uncomfortable with the assumption of linear relationships among variables needed for the more statistical procedures. Niemeyer, a psychologist, has pointed out that there are several research methods that are appropriate to assess outcome in constructive psychotherapy. He notes several examples, including the use of repertory grids, transcripts, analysis of development level, task analysis of chain events, stochastic modeling, and time series studies. He also notes as um, have others that more conversational ways of inquiry and to understand personal meaning need to be explored too. He stresses the need for diverse approaches to research for fuller understanding. Ethnographic qualitative research approaches and transcript analysis have been found useful in studying conservatives and approaches. And White and Epstein and others use the case study method in assessing outcome, not noting symptoms, relief in clients, finding new ways of measuring outcomes in narrative therapy, and then conducting more research on these newer approaches are important directions for the future. Perspectives. The postmodern approach to social treatment, which have been becoming so prominent in the family therapy movements, are relevant for and are for becoming utilized by social workers because this theory is a part of a cross-disciplinary trend, and because the approaches are useful with a wide variety of clients, this trend is likely to grow. More research will need to be conducted and new ways of conducting research will need to be found. However, before these approaches are fully accepted in the profession, social worker and family therapist Hoffman has expressed this hope that this movement will facilitate a return of therapy as an art of conversation as opposed to the procedural scientific activity. She also expressed belief that the aesthetic metaphors are closer to home than the biological or machine metaphor as we work with our clients, and she expressed the hope that these metaphors will also create an emancipatory dialogue that is socially and politically sensitive to our clients' needs. Indeed, the aim of narrative approach of understanding and individualizing each client in his or her social context and the emphasis on mobilizing strength is in the best tradition of social work practice. A social work profession.